Good afternoon. I haven't done a film lately because I've been very busy, but I thought I'd return to the subject of the increasing government measures approaching a full lockdown for this so-called coronavirus, the China virus. Now, at the outset, I said it was prudent to engage in a limited lockdown to preserve limited. It had to be very limited because otherwise it would cause economic catastrophe and a massive fall in our GDP. Our GDP is a measure of our growth. That's all it is. It's a measure of our growth, of our wealth. And we have seen a complete economic collapse, as I warned would be the case. So it was prudent to have a temporary lockdown because no one really knew what was going on. It was clear that it had to be very temporary and that we had to develop herd immunity very quickly, and we had to protect and ring fence the vulnerable. That was always the most sensible strategy to adopt, but it has never been adopted in this country. Instead of protecting the vulnerable, the government effectively killed them off by sending patients from hospitals into care homes, bringing the disease straight into the care homes. They didn't ring fence the care homes where the most vulnerable were. Instead, they send, for example, they have the police going around snooping to see if pubs are open after 10 o'clock. That's the sort of way the resources have been used. Instead of targeting them at the vulnerable, they're spread everywhere and totally misapplied. Now we see a situation where a whole range of doctors, academics, scientists have come out questioning the whole government's approach and suggesting that we should in fact go for the strategy of adopting herd immunity as soon as possible and putting all our resources into ring fencing the small number of people who are actually at risk. Nearly everybody isn't at any sort of risk at all from this virus. The vast bulk of the population are at no risk whatsoever, but there are small numbers of people who are at risk, and they are the ones who the resources should be targeted to protecting. Now, these academics, clearly they're academics. They live in their own little world. They're not used to dealing with governments, and they don't see the politics of this or the history of events behind this. And you can see they're confused as to why there's no dialogue, why the government won't engage with them, why the establishment ignores everything they say, because what they're saying, the government's not interested in that sort of discussion, and you can tell they're a bit nonplussed. These people have got safe and cosy careers. They're not going to threaten those careers. They've always been loyal to the state, and now they're stepping out of line, but they don't really realise they're stepping out of line because they don't really understand or grasp what this actually is really all about. The government's message has been blatantly contradictory. Initially they said we had to lock down to save the National Health Service and flatten the curve. That was the excuse for the lockdown. The measures now, what is the excuse for the measures now? There are very few deaths. There's no second wave of deaths. There's a slight bump, and most of the deaths, many of the deaths aren't even from coronavirus. They're just the people with coronavirus. We know that from the beginning. The whole thing has been vastly over-exaggerated. And secondly, hospital admissions have barely gone up either. So you don't need to have these measures to protect the NHS. What is the excuse? What is the reason for it all? Why are they doing it? And while this is going on, non-COVID or non-China virus related deaths are going through the roof. Cancers are going untreated, for example, and unscreened. Hancock, the health secretary, even threatened cancer patients with death sentences if the rate of infection didn't go down. That's the sort of level we've got to. So what is going on here? What is the actual reasoning? For sure, there's more to this than meets the eye. That's absolutely cast iron for sure. But we are living in the eye of the storm here. It's very difficult to have perspective to really know what's going on. Lots of people come up with outlandish theories. But what I'm going to try and do today is come up with some suggestions for what this is actually all about, what is going on here. I'm not going to suggest that the virus doesn't exist. It does exist. I'm not even going to suggest that it was unleashed upon the world deliberately as some sort of preconceived plan, because when you look at how the various regimes in the world responded initially, there was a lot of confusion. they didn't quite initially know what to do. So I don't believe it was a preconceived plan. But that isn't to say that once this situation arose, the powers that be, the global establishment in all countries, not just this country, have taken full advantage of the situation, and that is essentially what I think is going on. The age of the motor car, cheap air transport, gave great freedom to people to move around within a country, even abroad, to go abroad, see other places, gave great unparalleled levels of freedom to human beings, to humanity. The internet also offered the same sort of unleashing of freedom, the information age, where you could get information, news from a whole variety of sources that weren't dependent upon the mainstream media. It was a liberating time. We went through a period of liberation, actually, in many ways for humanity. And that resulted, what did that result in? It resulted in Brexit, and it resulted in Trump being elected in the United States, which weren't part of the global agenda, let's put it that way. Neither of those events were part of the global agenda. They were both instances where what you might describe as the plebs, the people, voted contrary to the wishes of the great and the good. Now, this is part of an age-old conflict that goes back to Roman times, which is something I've been dwelling on lately. In the Roman Republic, before the Caesars, before the emperors, there was a conflict between the senatorial class, who thought they had a divine right to rule the Roman Empire, to rule Rome, the rich autocrats, and people who appealed to the masses, to the plebs. And it was invariably a rogue, a rich rogue person who broke ranks, who appealed to the masses for support and did populist things. They're called the populares. Julius Caesar himself was a popular in the populare faction, and that's pretty much why he was assassinated by people from the senatorial class who didn't want to share power with the masses. That is one of the age-old conflicts that has been going on across society. Traditionally, ancient Saxon society, Celtic societies, kinship and lordship was based on a fellowship with the people within the tribal group. They didn't rule as overlords over them. They ruled as a benevolent ruler of their people. Same with clans in Scotland. That is the justification for ruling, when you rule benevolently on behalf of the people. But when you look at the portraits of the great and the good, the lords, the dukes, the earls, the monarchs, the statesmen of past centuries, you see them in their finery, in their silk clothes. The pictures which I'm going to show you are primarily from an exhibition at Buckingham Palace about the Prince Regent, where he's wearing his finery, silk clothes. He's looking at the audience with a degree of haughtiness and disdain. He is there by divine right. He has the finest food, the finest furniture, the finest house to live in, warmth, never goes hungry. Whereas everyone else in society is effectively living to put food on his table, to put clothes on his back, to give him fine chairs and great estates to live in. That is how society was ordered, and is still ordered, actually. And when you see their faces looking back at you, they don't look with fondness to the people, to the masses, to the multitude. That is what the new normal, the Build Back Better, that shared slogan shared by Trudeau, Joe Biden and Boris Johnson and other globalist world figures, that's what they mean by Build Back Better. It means putting the plebs back in their box, back in their little house from which they can hardly emerge, from which they will work from home, and they'll get their food delivered to them at their home by parcels. They won't have cars, their internet access will be restricted. The social media companies, of course, are all part of this situation. That is what the new normal is, and that is the way they're going. That is the Great Reset. It's a world where they're frightened, rather shamefully, the English people into compliance to such an extent where the English people would willingly abolish Christmas, where the English people would vote to do away with the old pub. That is what they have managed to achieve in a few short months, rather shamefully. And what is the single greatest threat to the globalist agenda? The transnational corporations, what is the biggest threat? And which is the biggest economy in the world? Well, I'll tell you, you shouldn't need me to tell you, the biggest economy in the world is the United States, and it's run by Donald Trump, who is against the global agenda. That is the biggest threat to their agenda ever. So it stands to reason to me that they would do anything in their power to get rid of him. And I think a whole lot of this problem that we're seeing across the world is because this year is the election year for the United States, presidential election, and they want to get rid of Trump. They want to cause chaos to get him out. They'll do anything to get him out. That fundamentally is what it's about, and enforcing control with a whole series of measures to exert compliance over us and to ratchet things up, to bring through a whole range of measures that would have taken them decades otherwise to bring through. They've brought it all through in one rush without even a whimper of opposition. The nation state is the only bulwark against the power of globalism. Now, it's interesting to me, at the time of the Battle of Waterloo, every great family in England lost someone. They lost some blood. They bled on the Battle of Waterloo, leading our troops under the Duke of Wellington to victory. It's also interesting that many of these portraits are from the diplomats around Europe, the diplomats and potentates around Europe. And when Napoleon was finally defeated, and the Napoleonic regime and the French Revolution were a sort of plebeian revolt against the autocracy of France, the royal family of France, they did a big reset. They set up the Council of Europe, where the European leaders met regularly to enforce their rule across Europe for generations more to come. Well, that's what they hoped. And you see on those faces of some of these plutocrats at the end of the Napoleonic War, the same sort of faces you see in the plutocrats who run the European Union today. I've always been a monarchist, naturally speaking. Naturally I've been a monarchist, but I find it very hard to be a monarchist in support of our current monarchy. I'll deal with a few other issues. For example, I'll give this an example. Sweden developed the herd immunity approach, essentially. They had very few restrictions, they didn't really go into lockdown, they suffered much less economically than any other country. Their death rate is not appreciably higher than any other country, much lower than many other comparable countries in fact, even though they failed to protect their vulnerable in their care homes. They had a similar care home situation to this country, so that did boost up their death rate, although they haven't really had an appreciable second wave because they've effectively developed herd immunity. They've got it over and done with at much less economic cost to anyone else. Now, this is a slightly strange thing because Sweden is an incredibly liberal country, a fully paid up member of the globalist agenda. They're fully paid up to that. So why were they allowed to go their own way? I would suggest because they're a small country and they wanted to see how it went in different countries, and it was a bit of an experiment. Germany, which is an even more fully paid up member of the globalist elite as far as their ruling class goes, they have been able to get away with reporting the number of China virus deaths very low. you have to blatantly have died of the China virus to be counted as a death for that reason in Germany, which is why their death rate is so low. And everyone says, oh, how wonderfully Germany has managed this. It's only because it's because they've reported their deaths differently to everyone else. The other interesting factor I'll draw out from this is, when this whole thing broke, a lot of excitable and rather foolish talk was made about how it's all due to 5G, which was total nonsense. It's died a bit of a death now. There's several reasons why it's not due to 5G, partly because 5G has barely been rolled out in many of the countries, and even in this country 5G has barely been rolled out. That was why there was all that debate about Huawei being involved in it, because they hadn't even up to that stage rolled out most of the masts. So most of the country still isn't even covered by 5G. Secondly, the global elites will not bring out a measure which will affect them adversely as well. If all the 5G masts were beaming out harmful beams, that would affect members of the global elites and their families as well. Another point they make is that we should wait for a vaccine. The reality is, even by the most optimistic accounts, a vaccine won't be fully available for everybody for over a year, because they'd have to manufacture it for everybody. By the time they do that, we could have just developed herd immunity, and which provides the same protection naturally that a vaccine would supposedly give. Vaccines usually take years to develop, so it's likely that any vaccine that's rushed out won't be either fully effective or could possibly have harmful side effects that hadn't been properly tested. So the vaccine strategy is very high risk, and it means this thing's going to be going on for another year or so, which we can't afford because of the other deaths and the fact that hardly anyone is actually dying of it now anyway. So the vaccine is a big red herring. So what's the conclusion to all this? The conclusion is we should be ending all the lockdown measures, everyone back to work, no masks, nothing. Crowds back at football, pubs open, everything back to normal. Let the disease run its course through the population, but keep the vulnerable ring-fence still. Put all the resources into that and that alone. Will the government do this? No, there's no chance in hell the government will do this. We must get our people to react. We must propagandise amongst our people so that our people resist. They resist. We don't even know if there's going to be elections next year now. We must resist in every way possible, legally, but resist. And that must be the message that gets out. Our people are cowed and on their knees. We must get them off their knees, get them to realise they've been conned. That is our message.